Greetings. This is Phil St. Romain from the staff at Heartland Center for Spirituality in Great Bend, Kansas. In this teaching, we will reflect on the meaning of ego and false self, two terms often used in spiritual teachings, though in different ways. Sometimes the two are even used as synonyms, so we will be addressing these kinds of issues in this presentation. First, let's talk about self, another term used in many ways, sometimes even as a way of referring to ego or even false self. The approach I will take, however, is the one I used in my book, God and I, Exploring the Connections Between God, Self, and Ego. There I describe the self as human spiritual consciousness, including our experiences of awareness, intelligence, and freedom. Self in this sense encompasses the psyche and the body, making use of data received from them in its operations. This understanding is similar to that of the psychiatrist Carl Jung. Where self is the totality of human consciousness, ego is a narrower experience of self in its reflective, intentional operations. For the psychologist Jane Lebinger, ego is the frame of reference we use to interact and interpret the world. Lebinger here is recognizing that ego has something of a form, usually derived from its self-concept or self-image, the way we picture or think about ourselves. Persona is another term usually referring to the outer mask or outer identity of the ego that we show to the world. It can be an authentic expression of the ego, or a means to try to manipulate others' perceptions and judgments, and that's really what we mean by the term false self. We'll expound more on this shortly. The value of the ego in the psychology of Jung and Lebinger can be described as follows. First, the ego helps to mediate between the inner world of consciousness and the outer world. We can't process everything out there or inside of us, so the ego regulates impulses, and through its access to our reason, imagination, and emotions, helps us to interpret reality. Ego is also about actualizing and empowering our human potential through its reflective and intentional operations. Because we have an ego, we can pursue goals and actions that help us develop our interests. Through the exercise of ego, then, we come to a sense of personal identity, an I, with a particular form. This, of course, is an ongoing discovery. Sometimes self is depicted as a large circle, with ego a smaller circle within self. But there are other ways to image this as well. Note here the relationship between ego and self. They're not separate, and the dotted lines around ego indicate that its experiences of awareness, intelligence, and will are open to influence from self, which is the source of those potentialities. The persona is shown here as the outer face the ego shows the world. And what about God? God is to be found everywhere in this image. As Ephesians 4 verse 6 puts it, God is over all, in all, and through all. Our human consciousness and its self and ego participate in God, who is the ongoing source of our existence. Here's another perspective on these terms as 4 zones of consciousness. This one's from my book, God and I. First, we note the ego persona zone and its concern largely with external reality. That's not a bad thing, and it doesn't imply phoniness. After all, we need to pick out appropriate clothing and prepare ourselves in many ways to function in the world. Although what we are calling the false self is centered in the ego persona, it doesn't completely encompass it. More interior to that is the ego self zone, where we can attend to our inner thoughts, feelings, desires, longings, and so forth. Sometimes this is called the inner self, and in healthy people, it is in a harmonious relationship with the persona. Being in touch with this inner self calls for a different kind of attentiveness than the persona requires. Silence, journaling, dialoguing with others, for example. Worth mentioning here, too, is that the ego can also be in an interpersonal relationship with God, in which we come to experience ourselves as known and loved by God. Finally, there is the most interior zone, self and God. At this level, we experience our lives emerging from God's creative will moment by moment. Coming to know God at this level is one of the fruits of contemplative disciplines. Note that a dotted line separates the other zones to indicate that these all constitute zones of experience within a person. The solid line between God and self indicates that we are dealing here with two distinct beings, the divine and the human. The Christian spiritual life is about becoming lovingly awake in all these zones of consciousness. Zooming in a little more on what we mean by false self now. It's not a different self, as we've noted, but the ego persona, the mask we show the world, excessively focused on the outside world for its sense of approval, meaning, and security. It's a response to inner brokenness, an inner feeling that I'm not okay, usually shame, resentment, and anxiety that are a consequence of rejection and other instances of non-love that leave one feeling worthless unless one does the right things. The false self persona is ever on the lookout for what those right things might be, and of making sure that others notice if we do them. False self-persona suppresses the expression of authentic egoic attitudes, feelings, and interests. It's constantly evaluating the outer environment, comparing ourselves with others, editing what's okay to reveal or not about oneself. After a while, one might not even be sure what one really thinks or feels about something. False self-influences distort ego development and its expression of the unique individual that each of us really is. So then the false self is not a different self, but a way of referring to an ego that has become overly attached to its identity, ideas, labels, judgments, in a dualistic sense. By this I mean that ego experiences itself to be separate in a negative sense from others, creation, and God. It is often preoccupied with comparisons and judgments of others, and needs others to confer some kind of approval to feel okay. This is how many spiritual writers use the term ego. For them, ego is a synonym for false self, but they're missing out on some very positive aspects of ego in defining things this way. In summary, let's review the role of the ego in Christian spirituality. First, we could say that the ego is meant to be a servant of God and the human self. Any time it becomes the most important concern, it has lost its way. But that need not be the case. We need not live out of that sort of ego-centeredness or narcissism. Ego is the responsible center of our consciousness, and as such, it has an important role to play in our decision-making. It's a means to develop our potential. Its reflective and volitional disposition enables us to direct our energies in accord with our values in ways that support our ongoing development in a healthy manner. The ego and its self-image give our lives a sense of form, which helps us understand ourselves better, just so we don't get too attached to that form. It is the personal I in relation to God's thou, capable of growing in knowledge of how one is known and seen by God. And finally, the egoic I is the one who is capable of becoming more authentic in its attitudes and self-understanding, and open to Spirit-led guidance and discernment. As such, it is an experience of our true self, the person we experience ourselves to be in the light of divine love.